Good afternoon. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm Prudence Daly and I'm Chairman of the Prayer Book Society. And it's my very great pleasure to welcome everyone to our online conference this afternoon. This is the first time we've ever done anything like this, so I hope you'll bear with us in the event of any technical hitches. This whole event is being managed by and run by a team of volunteers, and I want to say a special thank you to John Riding, one of the trustees of the Prayer Book Society, who's acting as our technical producer this afternoon and is currently staring at a screen which looks not unlike the flight deck of the USS Enterprise. John also happens to be director of Cantores Ecclesia, the choir whose beautiful singing you'll have heard if you tuned in a few minutes early this afternoon. And just one practical point. Please feel free to type questions for the speakers into the YouTube function, into the chat function, I should say, on YouTube. We'll then select a few of these to put to the speakers on your behalf. So I'm now delighted to welcome our first speaker, Professor Philip Williamson. Professor Williamson's research interests include the intersection between church and state since the 1560s, and he is, among other things, principal investigator and chief editor for a 4-volume project on British state prayers, fasts and thanksgivings. He's therefore ideally qualified to address the historical aspects of the prayer book and pandemics. Over to you, Professor Williamson.
Thank you very much. Thank you also for the invitation. It's been very interesting working on this lecture, preparing the text. Okay. The Book of Common Prayer, in its successive editions from 1549 to 1662, was produced in an age of epidemics and pandemics. The worst of these contagions left enduring impressions in the text of the prayer book, which is not only a religious liturgy, but also a historical record, retaining evidence of the circumstances in which it was created. I shall consider this evidence in the first part of this lecture. But the prayer book's provisions and prayers were never regarded as adequate for severe outbreaks of mortal disease, any more than they were for other crises or other great events. My main themes are to comment on this inadequacy and to consider alternative acts of worship that were ordered for these special occasions. Despite the requirements in successive acts of uniformity, royal proclamations, episcopal injunctions and church canons that ministers must adhere strictly to the Book of Common Prayer, the prayer book did not provide all the services and prayers that were read throughout the Church of England. In practice, the term common prayer had a double meaning. Not just common in the sense of collective prayer, of services said together in congregations, but also common in the sense of ordinary prayer, of services for normal use. For extraordinary occasions, and sometimes for long periods, the prescribed services were supplemented by special prayers or altered by special services. The prayer book was not the only authorized liturgy used in the church. For epidemics and pandemics, special provisions were made periodically for 4 centuries, ending in the 1860s. My further theme then is to comment on the changes in this long practice of special acts of worship. The pandemic, which chiefly left a mark on the original editions of the prayer book, was bubonic plague. Bubonic plague, which had been endemic in England for 2 centuries, since the Black Death in 1348. Outbreaks of varying severity and regional incidents remained a common experience, to such an extent that Cranmer and his associates almost took them for granted. The plague was listed among other minatory afflictions in a petition in the Litany published in every edition of the prayer book from 1549. From lightning and tempest, from plague, pestilence and famine, from battle and murder, and from sudden death, good Lord, deliver us. Plague was also mentioned in the preface to the Communion of the Sick, again, almost as a matter of course, as people should always be in readiness to die, curates were instructed to encourage parishioners from time to time, but especially in the plague time, to be frequent in taking communion, a phrase changed in 1662 to especially in the time of pestilence or other infectious disease. The exhortation in the communion service contained a phrase which encapsulated what long remained the religious understanding of natural and human crises, drawn from the example of Old Testament Israel. These calamities were God's punishments for the collective sins of the nation or kingdom. We kindle God's wrath over us. We provoke him to plague us with diverse diseases and sundry kinds of death. Epidemics became a specific subject of prayer in the prayer book for the second edition in 1552. New provisions were prompted by an outbreak, not of plague this time, but of the sweat or sweating sickness, a viral infection that killed with startling suddenness and which had caused some 15,000 deaths during the previous year. One consequence was a new rubric in the communion of the sick, prescribing what ministers should do in the time of plague, sweat, and such other like contagious times of sickness or diseases. As these words remained unaltered in all later editions of the prayer book, this last outbreak of the sweat in 1551 has had a very long liturgical history. The chief change in 1552 was a new occasional prayer, meaning a prayer for use at particular times. Prayers for rain and for fine weather had been placed at the end of the communion in 1549. Now, in 1552, they were moved to the end of the litany and joined by new prayers for further periods of anxiety or crisis, including the prayer in the time of any common plague or sickness. After appealing to the precedent of God sending a plague to Israel under King David that killed 70,000 before he relented and saved the rest of the people, the prayer asked for God's pity and for his withdrawal of infection. This expressed the prevailing belief for all great crises. God's punishments might be ended if prayers and collective repentance could evoke his merciful withdrawal of the punishment. The success of these petitions to God, as shown by the end of the crisis, rightly required thanksgivings to God and promises of continuing repentance as evidence that the lesson had been learned. But only in 1604 were the occasional petitionary prayers complemented by occasional thanksgiving prayers. These included, after a severe plague outbreak in 1603, two alternative prayers for deliverance from the plague. In the more thorough revision of the prayer book in 1662, following persistent plague outbreaks during the previous 60 years, the petitionary prayer in the time of any common plague or sickness was reinforced by reference to a second Old Testament precedent and by an appeal for God's acceptance of the people's atonement. These prayers for particular themes are now gathered in a separate section and entitled Prayers and Thanksgivings upon Several Occasions, with a rubric which allowed their use, as was surely already a common practice, at the end of morning and evening, as well as the end of the litany. How often and how widely the occasional prayers and thanksgivings were read is unknowable. The surviving records do not yield this type of information. Presumably their use was left to the discretion of ministers or sometimes to directions by archdeacons or bishops, with the effect and perhaps the intention that they were read according to the varied geographical incidence of epidemics and other crises across the kingdom. As such, these types of prayers were permitted and flexible departures from uniformity, read as appropriate in different regions or different localities, as well as at differing times. Nevertheless, the occasional prayers were often regarded as insufficient for the most severe episodes or for the biggest public events that affected all parts of the kingdom, when repentance and supplication needed to be greater, deeper, and broader, seeking mercy for the sins of the whole nation. During the early Reformation, the occasional prayers would certainly have been considered inadequate in comparison with Catholic liturgies. Cranmer's intention for the Book of Common Prayer was to produce not just a Protestant, vernacular, and uniform liturgy, but a less numerous, a consolidated and more convenient set of religious services contained within one volume. He selected from, translated and transformed core elements from the separate books of the Catholic processional, breviary, manual and missal, and set aside much of the further material. The omitted material included special prayers and special masses which had accumulated over the centuries for use during calamities or great public events. Sarum Missal contained as many as 4 votive masses for human epidemics, including masses to turn plague and to turn away pestilence, as well as a mass for epidemics among farm animals. With the rejection of these Catholic and Latin prayers and liturgies, what was to be done if the occasional prayers seemed insufficient during very severe national crises or for great national events? The answer was being found even as the Book of Common Prayer was created. During the 10 years after the break with Rome in 1533, the royal supremacy over the new Church of England was exercised to order special acts of worship for several national events and crises, including drought, dysentery, and other diseases in 1540. These at first made continued use of existing processional texts, still in Latin. But military campaigns against France in 1544 and again in 1545 gave Cranmer the opportunity to issue his first liturgy. The litany began as a special service before it was integrated into the first prayer book as a regular service. Then, during the sweating sickness in 1551, the Act of Uniformity in the prayer book was set aside with the issue of another English liturgy, a special service which was quite distinct from the services in the prayer book. This practice of temporary suspensions of the prescribed church services and substitution of new texts was developed further during the reigns of Queen Elizabeth and the early Stuart kings. Special acts of worship settled into 3 kinds: prayers, services, and religious days. Special prayers were simply added to the existing daily services. For more serious or greater occasions, special services substantially changed these daily services. For the most serious or the greatest occasions, special services were read on special religious days, appointed either as fast days or as Thanksgiving days, which were appointed in the middle of the week and required suspension of ordinary employment in the same manner as on Sundays and holy days. These special acts of worship, with their insistent appeal to the Old Testament, assumed that, as was shown by the history of the Jewish people, divine providence had a national operation and national effects. England and later the United Kingdom were spiritual bodies, judged and punished or forgiven as a nation, as a modern Israel. Accordingly, special worship was ordered by the nation's rulers for observance by all adults in all churches on the same day, in the belief that collective and simultaneous worship would intensify the force and effect of prayer and repentance. From 1559 to the 1640s, 67 special acts of worship were ordered in England and Wales, almost all of them observed more than once, and some for several weeks or months. During these 8 decades, common prayer was modified or supplemented for an average of perhaps 10 days a year, although this average disguises prolonged periods in which it was effectively superseded. 12 of the 67 orders were for plague outbreak, some of which led to the longest replacements of prayer book services with special services, for up to 6 months in 1563 to 4 and 10 months in 1603 to 4. During the civil wars and interregnum, special acts of worship became still more common, though now, of course, conducted in most churches without the prayer book, by extemporary prayer and sermons. After the Restoration and after the readoption and revision of the Book of Common Prayer in 1662, the practice remained a common act of state, although fast and Thanksgiving days were now normally just for single dates. From 1660 to the 1980s, over 440 special acts of worship were appointed, which, except during the 1640s and 1650s. The text for these extraordinary acts of worship were provided by special forms of prayer, published by the royal printer and sent to all places of worship in the Church of England. In contrast to the special prayers and votive masses collected in the earlier Catholic liturgies, the texts of these extraordinary Anglican prayers and services did not become standardized and gathered together within volumes. Each special act of worship had its own form of prayer, single prayers, or many pages for services. These several hundred forms used to accumulate in parish chests, any now found in county record offices or in research libraries. Collectively, they provide a parallel history of worship in the Church of England, alongside the Book of Common Prayer. These special forms of prayer did not wholly replace the texts in the prayer book. For special prayers, the forms simply printed the text of these prayers with a rubric stating that they were to be read, where they were to be read within the daily services, in similar manner to the occasional prayers. Special services use much of the daily prayer book services, but modified them in sometimes complex and lengthy ways. Rubrics, lessons, suffrages, collects, and psalms were changed, and new prayers, psalms, collects, and sometimes homilies or exhortations were added. From 1625 to 1685, the forms for special services were printed the whole text in full, the retained text in the prayer book, together with the modifications and with new material, with the result that such forms could be over 100 pages in length. At other times, only the modified and new texts were printed, and from the 1680s, the forms usually stated that the special service shall be the same with the usual office, except where it is in this office otherwise appointed. In these cases, ministers had to use both the prayer book and the special form of prayer, shifting from one to the other. Special services and special religious days were ordered for numerous causes, including good and bad harvests, earthquakes, royal occasions, plots, invasion threats, and the most common cause for wars. But the model was established during the severe plague outbreak of 1563, which eventually killed almost 80,000 people, including nearly a quarter of the population of London. Special services were held on Sundays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, most extensively on Wednesdays, weekly fast day. A choice of special lessons was given for morning prayer. On Wednesdays, the morning prayer was followed by 15 minutes of private prayer. On both Wednesdays and Fridays, the litany was extended by a selection of new prayers, each several hundred words long, and on Wednesdays by a new composite psalm drawn from verses in the Old Testament and Apocrypha, beginning, "O come, let us humble ourselves and fall down before the Lord with reverence and fear." Also on Wednesdays, there was either a sermon or one of 7 homilies, including a new homily on the justice of God, nearly 6,000 words in length. The form of prayer also contained an order for the general fast, setting out how people were to spend Wednesdays. All persons aged 16 to 60 were to eat just one simple meal. The wealthy and comfortable were to increase almsgiving to the poor. All labour was to cease. The day was to be devoted to church services, family prayers, and study of scriptures and other godly works, with no plays, pastimes, nor idleness or lewd, wicked, and wanton behaviour. As the plague subsided during 1564, after some 6 months of this weekly regime of services and fasts, the Thanksgiving services on on Sundays, Wednesday, and Fridays had changed psalms in morning prayer with a new composite psalm and a new collect of over 700 words in the litany. Special services and fast days were ordered during further severe plague outbreaks in 1593, 1603, 1625, twice during 1640, and in 1665. Except in 1640, the forms of prayer borrowed extensively from the form for 1563, but with the emphasis now shifted from the litany to the other services. In 1603, morning prayer took material from the earlier special litany, and the composite psalm, "O come, let us humble ourselves," replaced the Venite. Evening prayer was now modified as well, taking elements from the special morning prayer with the composite psalm replacing the Magnificat. 4 new optional prayers were provided, with a 4,000-word exhortation as an alternative to a sermon or homily. Further innovations followed in 1625. Fast and Thanksgiving days were now ordered by royal proclamation, and only weekly fast days were appointed, without special services on Sundays and Fridays. In evening prayer, the composite psalm now followed the Magnificat. The communion service was also substantially changed, with addition of the special prayers for the day and insertion of prayers from elsewhere in the prayer book, stressing the penitential aspect of with the collect for Ash Wednesday and prayers from the commentation service. Fast days required remarkable stamina. There are descriptions of congregations spending as many as 6 or 9 hours in church, with several sermons, as well as the full series of services. To modern minds, ordering people to gather for long periods in churches has an obvious risk. What was intended to be the remedy for the epidemic could make it very much worse. Early modern governments and churchmen had some understanding of these risks. The order for the fast in 1563 stated that in infected places, ministers should keep infected people apart from the rest of the congregation. In 1593 and 1603, ministers were instructed to shorten their services because it was dangerous to keep people for the whole day in thick and close assemblies. In 1625, royal orders to the clergy stated that church service should be held only in places which were free and safe from danger of infection. That any persons coming from infected areas should be excluded from the services, and that within the infected areas, the fasts and prayers should be observed in private houses, anticipating by nearly 400 years the recent constraints on public worship. Other remedies than prayer and fasting alone were acknowledged. In prayers and the exhortation in 1603, God was praised for the provision of other necessary and profitable measures, medicines, advice from physicians, and other means of avoiding, removing, and repressing contagion including good and wholesome orders and decrees, meaning the quarantine orders which governments had been publishing during plague outbreaks since the 1570s. During the plague in 1665, the last great plague, the frequency of fast days was reduced to the first Wednesday of each month, with only a special litany on Wednesdays in the other weeks. While the services retained substantial elements from 1563, including much of the composite psalm, they underwent further revision, and there was now more systematic attention to material relief. As ordered by the Royal Proclamation, collections were to be taken at all church services and paid to the bishop, primarily to assist plague victims in their diocese, but with any surplus sent to the epicentre of the English epidemic in London, in effect creating a national relief fund. The epidemic of 1665 was the last serious English outbreak of the plague, but it was not the end of special acts of worship against this disease. From 1720 to 1723, these special acts of worship were ordered to avert the spread of the plague from France to the British Isles. 2 prayers from the Commination service and 2 special prayers were added to the litany for use every Sunday, Wednesday and Friday for as long as 40 months, over 3 years. And 2 fast days were appointed in 1720 and 1721, now held on a Friday and with completely new special services. From the first fears of a new outbreak, the government had imposed a 40-day quarantine on all ships from affected foreign ports, followed by further effective preventative measures, so that the Thanksgiving Day in 1723 marked a genuine success, with a negligible number of deaths, in contrast to over 100,000 in France. For the next 100 years, no human epidemic was so severe as to prompt acts of special worship. But in a still largely agricultural society, diseases in farm animals could have very serious effects for the food supply and economic life. The Catholic Missal had, as I mentioned, included a votive mass for use during cattle plague. A panzootic of this disease led to the longest ever period of special worship in the Church of England. A special prayer used in the liturgy or at the end of the morning or evening prayer for almost 11 years from 1748, ending with the Thanksgiving prayer in 1759. A further epidemic of cattle plague in 1865 and 1866 was marked by 2 issues of petitionary prayers added to morning and evening prayer on Sundays, ending after 12 months with a Thanksgiving prayer. The final human pandemic to cause changes in prayer book services was cholera, which spread from India to Europe from the late 1820s. The special acts of worship relating to successive outbreaks of cholera have particular significance because they were marked by changes and by decline in the practice, both in general terms and specifically for epidemics. During the first outbreak of cholera from 1831 to 1833, which affected hundreds of thousands of people and killed over 20,000, as many as 5 orders for special worship were issued. Special prayers for protection from arrival of the epidemic were added before the litany or towards the end of morning prayer, using material from the service which had been read in similar circumstances for plague as long ago as 1720. After the government quarantine failed, these prayers were replaced with prayers for use during the epidemic, read for perhaps 14 months. Only a single fast day was held on a Wednesday, with the services yet again using parts of the composite psalm from 1563 and again using material from 1720. Later, a Thanksgiving prayer was added to morning and evening prayer in a new style of use in localities as these became free of infection, before a general Thanksgiving Day was ordered for the end of the epidemic, now held on a Sunday rather than in midweek. The frequency of these orders for special worship in 1831 to 33 derived not just from fear of the infection, but from wider political and religious crises caused by Catholic emancipation, parliamentary reform, popular protest, and pre-millenarian evangelicalism, conditions which provoked new degrees of controversy about special worship. Petitions were organised for and against a general fast. The subject was raised in Parliament. Radical protest took place on the fast day, which was lampooned as a fast day and challenged by calls for a feast day for political reforms. The texts for the special worship continued as they had since the 1560s to present mortal infection as God's punishment for national sins, and prayer and repentance as the principal remedy for contagion. But political and public attitudes towards special worship were now changing and becoming more sceptical or critical. This was still more evident during the most severe outbreak of cholera in 1848 and 1849, when around 50,000 died. The government only reluctantly ordered special prayers and refused to appoint a fast day. But these caused such outrage to religious opinion that at the end of the outbreak, the government reverted to the traditional practice of a Thanksgiving Day held in the middle of the week. In 1865 and 1866, a further cholera epidemic coincided with the outbreak of cattle plague, but the government again rejected appeals for a fast day and ordered only special prayers for both cholera and cattle plague in tandem. The reasons for these changed attitudes are complex. Orders by the state for special acts of worship had become less acceptable among the religious public, certainly to nonconformists and Roman Catholics, who now had full political rights, but also to High Church Anglicans uneasy with such conspicuous Erastianism. Liberal and philanthropic opinion criticised fast days as depriving poor families of a day's wages. Prevailing religious beliefs were shifting. There was less emphasis on God as judge and on special providences, on periodic divine interventions in the natural and human worlds, and more emphasis on a benevolent God and on a general providence, which had given humans the intellectual and moral capacities to mitigate, control, or avoid crises. Religion, it was now commonly argued, should embrace scientific and medical advances, which successfully provided natural rather than supernatural explanations and remedies for epidemics. During a cholera outbreak in 1853, which killed around 10,000 people, the Home Secretary, Lord Palmerston, publicly rejected proposals for a fast day because, he argued, the true providential remedy for infections was improved sanitation and better cleanliness. Queen Victoria, who as sovereign was ultimately responsible for state orders for special worship, had similar opinions. In 1849, she privately dismissed the belief that a general fast would end the epidemic as superstitious and instead urged better health measures. Thereafter, she criticised all proposals for fast days and most types of special prayers and services, and in some cases prevented their appointment. The effect of all this was that general acts of worship changed in character. There were no longer state orders. There was a change towards special worship being ordered by the church themselves. And during the First World War, the leaders of the various churches came together to create new types of special worship, particularly national days of prayer, as they were called. Although in the 1950s, these types of national acts of special worship declined because it was no longer thought appropriate at a time of declining attendance in churches and declining belief in God to call the whole nation to special worship. As I mentioned, special worship for disease ended in the 1860s, largely because of changed attitude towards the relationship between religion and science. There was no special worship called for the pandemic, the flu pandemic in 1918-1919, which killed as many as 200,000 people in Britain, partly because of this changed attitude towards medicine, but also, of course, because it was that pandemic was overwhelmed by the greater crisis of the First World War. These changes in special worship also affected the way in which services operated. And indeed, the changes in special worship were part of the general movement away from the Book of Common Prayer, which we've seen in recent decades. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Philip. I think it puts our present day situation very much in context. So I've had a few questions that have come up in the chat. So first of all, a question from Daniel Newman. The Sacrament Act of 1547 requires that communion be given in both kinds except in case of necessity. Is there evidence that that this has in view plague and sickness? And has the denial of the cup ever historically been part of the response to plague and sickness?
I confess I don't know how that worked. Yes, I mean, it's not something which is evident in the rubrics of the prayer book at all. It's a sort of aspect which will be found by really close study of religious texts over the centuries, which I'm afraid I've not undertaken. So I can't really help you on that point. But it is the case that there were increasingly from the 17th century precautions taken against the spread of plague, and it seems likely that that would have occurred. In time, it would have been accepted that were dangers.
Thank you. Question from Ben Somerville. Do you think it's possible to interpret the prayer book's words on plagues in a way which sees them as not being caused directly by God as punishment, but instead by chance as a secondary result of something else?
Yes, I mean, obviously, the text of the prayer book was pored over just as the Bible was, very intensively by a whole range of theologians and other writers on religious matters. So there would have been different interpretations of the words in the prayer book. And sermons would have, again, given rather different interpretations. So it's possible that that reading was taken from the text of the prayer book. Yes.
Question from Ian Milne. Although we know what was printed and ordered, do you have any idea how people received and used the prayer book and the supplementary material in practice? Did it strike a chord with people, or was it felt in any way wanting?
Well, the special forms of prayer it's difficult to know how closely they were read. I mean, in a sense, it's like the prayer book itself. How does one know whether the prayer book services and the special forms of prayer were read as they were printed in all the places of worship throughout England and Wales? There's even in the early centuries some doubt over whether the special forms of prayer were actually received or bought in each place of worship. And it's curiosity that we do know that large numbers of the special forms of worship were printed. We know that there was a system by which they were distributed to all the dioceses and from each of the dioceses to each of the churches. But when they arrived in the parishes had to buy them. And if the parish didn't have funds available, they may not have actually bought them. Sometimes you find during long periods of special worship, you find repeat orders as if there is a problem about these forms of prayer being used. But the evidence for the extent to which the forms of prayer were read strictly is difficult to come by.
There's a question here from Adrian Thomas. Is there any difference between prayers for epidemics that affect many people at the same time and prayer for an illness that affects smaller numbers, such as the prayer for the healing of the king's evil, scrofula?
Yes, well, the prayer for the king's evil, that was a service, as it were, in one place, in the presence of the king, or at least a deputy for the king. So held essentially in the royal court or close to the royal court. So in one centre, whereas the prayers, either the special prayers or the special services, were supposed to be held in every single parish. So these are slightly different types of services.
And Daniel Heaton asks, does the decline in fasting relate to the rise of nonconformists, perhaps viewing the practice as popish?
Now then, very interesting question. In fact, the archbishops of the Church of England in the early 1560s, they introduced fasting in a very careful way. They were aware that they could be accused of being popish. And so they made a special case, as it were, for a Protestant form of fasting. Now, fasting became very well established, not just among, as it were, the regular or ordinary elements in the Church of England, but also among many of the those who would later be called Protestants, even some of the separatists, who didn't regard fasting as popish at all. They regarded it as biblical, as scriptural. And from the really from the 1570s right the way through to the 19th century, many of the nonconformist groups were actually very keen on fasting, more so than they held fast much more commonly than was held in the Church of England. So no, it's not really the case that the nonconformists were against fasting. What they were against was the notion that fast should be ordered by the state. They didn't like state orders. Fasting should be, as it were, spontaneous, a response to particular circumstances, not something imposed by what you could regard as a civil authority. Sorry.
I'm just going to squeeze in one more, another one from Ian Milne. Do you know whether any consideration was ever given to adding any of the special supplementary material to the BCP permanently, for example, in 1662?
No, it's very curious that the records for 1662 don't indicate that any of these, any material from special forms of prayer would be included. No, there's no sort of indication of that.
Well, thank you very much indeed again, Professor Williamson, for what has been a most interesting talk. And I know that I, for one, have learned a lot that I didn't previously know. I think we're going to have to call it a day there. So there'll now be a short break, and the next conference session will begin at 3 p.m. Thank you very much.
Thank you.